Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. You have certainly heard the name Genghis Khan. Yet who was he in reality? A barbarian who brought chaos and destruction, or a genius who reshaped the course of world history and left behind a legacy that would influence the fate of entire continents? In this video, we will examine everything step by step, from his childhood to his death. You will learn how a boy named Temujin became an outcast deprived of family, support, and protection. How he managed to unite the Mongol tribes that for centuries had known nothing but war with one another. How he created an army that in only a few years conquered China, Central Asia, Persia, and advanced all the way to the Caucasus. What mysteries surrounded the final years of Genghis Khan's life, and where his body disappeared. A secret that remains unsolved to this day. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In the boundless expanse of the Mongolian steppe, among hills, rivers, and endless winds, around the year 1162, a boy named Temujin was born, a person destined to leave an imprint on the history of the world. His father, Yesugei Baatar, belonged to the Borjigin clan, a branch of the Mongol tribe known as the Kiats. The Borjigin traced their lineage to the legendary Bodunchar, a descendant of the mythical ancestors of all Mongols, the Blue Wolf and the Grey Doe, the mythical founders of the clan. Yesugei was a brave man, skilled in battle and respected among the nomads, yet he did not possess absolute authority. At that time, the Mongolian lands were fragmented. Numerous tribes and clans, the Taichiuds, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, and many others, continuously formed alliances and just as quickly broke them. Between them erupted skirmishes and wars for pastures, livestock, and power. Temujin's mother, Hurlun, came from the Olkhunut tribe, a subgroup of the Merkits. According to legend, she had been abducted by Yesugei himself. When he once encountered a caravan in which Hurlun traveled together with her husband, he attacked it, killed her spouse Chiladu, and carried the young woman away, making her his chief wife. This custom, the abduction of a bride, was at that time a part of the harsh reality of nomadic life. Yesugei named his son Temujin in honor of a warrior from the Tatar tribe whom he had captured and killed in a recent raid. This name was meant to symbolize victory and strength. Yet soon, fate began testing the boy's family. When Temujin turned 9 years old, his father took him on a journey to the Conqueror tribe to arrange a marriage with a girl named Berta. The Conquerors were considered one of the most influential and numerous clans, and the union with them was an important step in strengthening the position of the Borjigins. By tradition, the boy was left with the bride's family so that he would grow among her relatives and become accustomed to his future home. While Temujin remained with the Conquerors, events occurred in the steppe that changed his life forever. On his way back home, Yesugei stopped among the Tatars, his old enemies. To avoid danger, he concealed his name, yet he was still recognized. The Tatars, remembering that Yesugei had participated in the killing of their kinsmen during previous conflicts, poisoned his food. Feeling severe pain, he managed to reach his camp, where he soon died. The death of the family's patriarch was catastrophic. In those times, social structure depended entirely on warrior men, and the loss of the head of the clan meant that the family became defenseless. Relatives who had previously followed Yesugei quickly abandoned his widow and children, seized almost all their livestock, and left them alone in the steppe. Hurlun displayed remarkable courage. She gathered the children, the eldest, Temujin, his younger brothers Kasar, Kachiyun, and Temugei, and their younger sister Temulun, and led them to places where they could find shelter from the winds and at least some resources for survival. They had to build shelters from branches with their own hands, catch fish, gather roots and berries, and hunt ground squirrels, birds, and small game. Sometimes they managed to obtain hares or small deer, yet more often their diet consisted of wild plants and the occasional fish. The steppe was merciless to the unprotected. Their family repeatedly became the target of raids, especially from the Taichiuds, who had once been allies of Yesugei. The Taichiuds not only denied them help, they contemptuously rejected them as people who had lost social status. Temujin grew up in these harsh conditions. He realized early that survival depended only on one's own strength, intelligence, and the ability to gather people around oneself. From childhood, he displayed determination, intolerance toward injustice, and a fierce sense of responsibility for the well-being of his family. One of the most famous episodes of his childhood is connected with his half-brother Bektar, the son of Yesugei by a junior wife. After their father's death, Bektar, being older than Temujin, began acting as head of the family, appropriating the best food and livestock, which caused growing resentment among the younger brothers. One day, Temujin and Kasar set an ambush for Bektar and killed him with arrows. By the standards of the steppe, this act was ambiguous. On the one hand, a violation of kinship laws, yet on the other, a defense of the family against unjust oppression. Their mother harshly rebuked them, but accepted them back, understanding that the act had become necessary for the unity and survival of the family. After this, Temujin fully assumed the role of the eldest. He personally directed their migrations, made decisions regarding hunting, pasture searches, and protection from raids. Yet isolation in the steppe always remained deadly. Eventually, the Taichi-Uds, learning that the family was vulnerable, launched a raid, captured Temujin, and took him to their camp. They placed a heavy wooden yoke, a kind of stocks, on his neck and hands, restricting movement and making escape nearly impossible. He spent several months in captivity, performing the dirtiest work and enduring constant humiliation. Yet in the camp of the Taichi-Uds, he attracted the attention of a poor herdsman named Sorkan Shira. One night, when the guards fell asleep, Sorkan Shira helped him remove the yoke, hid him in a pile of wool and hay, covered him with mats, and when morning came, showed him a safe path to freedom. This man risked his life for Temujin, and Temujin never forgot it. Later, when he became a Khan, he rewarded Sorkan Shira by granting freedom, land, and wealth to him and his descendants. Returning from captivity, Temujin was no longer the helpless child he had been. He now understood that in a world where each day could be one's last, survival belonged not to the richest or noblest, but to the one who could unite people, be a fair leader, and act mercilessly toward enemies. Thus ended the difficult yet fateful period of his life, the childhood of an outcast. Ahead awaited his first alliances, his first bloodshed, and his first attempts at building his own power in the steppe. Upon returning from captivity, Temujin found himself faced with a simple yet merciless truth. His family was far too weak to survive alone in the harsh and turbulent world of the steppe, where power belonged to those who could gather around themselves as many people as possible, men ready to fight and die for their leader. Only one goal lay before him: to build his own base of support, his own circle of loyal followers, and the only way to do so was through alliances, agreements, and victories. His first step was to go to the Conqueror clan, where his bride Berta remained. The alliance with this clan was not merely the fulfillment of a promise made by his father, Yasuge, but an important step in securing Temujin's position in the tribal hierarchy. Berta's family received him with honor, and soon the marriage took place, a marriage that strengthened political ties and became the foundation of deep personal affection. Berta remained not merely a wife, but a companion of exceptional intelligence and great personal courage throughout his life. Yet almost immediately tragedy struck. The Merkit tribe, the same tribe from which Yasuge had abducted Hurlan many years earlier, decided to avenge the ancient insult. They launched a sudden raid on Temujin's camp, defeated his people, drove away the livestock, and abducted Berta. This became his first true test as a leader. He knew he could not confront the powerful Merkits alone. Therefore, he turned to two influential allies: Togrul, the Khan of the Qara tribe, whose bond with Yasuge had long resembled brotherhood, and Jamuka, his childhood friend and sworn brother. His relations with Togrul were almost familial. In earlier years, Yasuge had helped Togrul reclaim his power within his own tribe, and ever since then, their families had remained close. Hearing Temujin's plea, Togrul agreed to support him, not only out of respect for Yasuge, but also because fighting the Merkits served his own interests. Jamuka likewise answered the call. Their combined forces set off. The army was impressive: Qara detachments, Jamuka's warriors, and Temujin's men, now strengthened by dozens of followers from impoverished families and those who sought a new master. The campaign against the Merkits was swift and successful. The enemy was defeated, their camps destroyed, and the captives, including Berta, liberated. Shortly afterward, she bore her first son, Yochi. Because she had spent several months in captivity, rumors about Chochi's origin quickly spread, yet Temujin, unwilling to allow a rift within his family, publicly acknowledged him as his own son. This victory became a turning point. People saw in Temujin not a boy outcast, not merely the son of a deceased chieftain, but a man capable of leading, negotiating, winning, and defending those who trusted him. From that moment, followers began flocking to him, mostly from among the commoners, the poor, and those dissatisfied with the old order. Yet the first cracks in his relationship with Jamuka also appeared. They still called each other brothers, but their visions for the future were diverging. Jamuka supported the old aristocratic system where power belonged to noble lineages. Temujin, however, began building a new order. He appointed leaders not by birth but by merit, bravery, loyalty, and ability. This made him extremely popular among all those who previously had no chance to rise. Temujin soon convened his first Kurultai of followers, where he was proclaimed Khan, not of all Mongols, but of all who accepted his authority. There he began forming an army based on the decimal principle, groups of 10, hundreds, thousands, and commanders of 10,000. This broke with tribal tradition, as it was based on personal merit rather than aristocratic lineage. He continued forging alliances, strengthening ties with the Qaraits, making peace with certain Tatar groups, and concluding agreements with the Uyghurs, who possessed literacy and a developed bureaucracy. Yet many resisted. The Taichi-Uds remained especially hostile, despising Temujin for his background. Temujin launched several raids against them, swift strikes aimed at seizing livestock and weakening their power. With each success, his fame grew, and more families joined him. Meanwhile, tensions with Jamuka deepened. Although they occasionally cooperated, beneath the gestures of brotherhood lay a struggle for influence. Jamuka watched with concern as Temujin drew to himself the lower classes, poorer families, younger sons, orphans, and slaves. Temujin's alliance with Togrul grew stronger. Their joint campaign against the Tatars was highly successful. At a battle near the Onon River, they dealt the Tatars a crushing defeat. This victory signaled that a great new force had appeared in the steppe. Togrul then formally granted Temujin the title of Khan, acknowledging him as an equal. But such recognition enraged many nobles of the old order, who could not accept that a man once abandoned in the steppe was now their equal. Despite the lingering symbolic brotherhood with Jamuka, their visions of power and justice were too different, and conflict now seemed inevitable. Thus ended the second stage of Temujin's rise, the stage in which he proved he could gather an army, build alliances, and challenge the old aristocracy. Ahead awaited the fight for unification, a fight in which no compromise would remain. By the early 1180s, it had become clear that the fragile peace between the two most influential leaders of the Mongol world, Temujin and Jamuka, existed only thanks to memories of their childhood friendship. Yet day by day, this friendship eroded, replaced by rivalry driven not by personal animosity alone, but by the question of who would determine the future of the Mongolian steppe. This conflict was not merely a clash of two personalities. Behind them stood two different worlds. Behind Jamuka stood the old aristocracy, the noble clans who had ruled for centuries according to lineage and ancient customs. Behind Temujin stood those who had never possessed power, the poor, the younger sons, the orphans, the shepherds, the slaves, and the warriors, for whom Temujin's new system, merit-based rather than lineage-based, was their only chance for a better life. The split became irreversible after the Kurultai of the year 1186, where Jamuka was proclaimed Gurkhan, the supreme ruler of all Mongols according to ancient tradition. This declaration showed unmistakably that the noble clans were not ready to accept Temujin's growing influence. Temujin did not attend the Kurultai, yet his answer was swift. He gathered his own followers, convened his own assembly, and declared himself Khan, not of all Mongols, but of those who chose to follow him and accept his new rules. Throughout the following year, both camps strengthened themselves. Every tribe and clan had to choose a side. Many nobles sided with Jamuka, while Temujin attracted those tired of the old hierarchy. By the summer of 1187, both armies were ready for a decisive battle. The chosen field was the plain of Dalim Baljut, near the origins of the Onon River, familiar ground well suited for cavalry maneuvers. Sources differ, yet it is believed that Jamuka commanded between 30,000 and 40,000 men, while Temujin had roughly half that number, between 15,000 and 20,000. Temujin's army followed the decimal structure he had been establishing. Units of 10 forming units of 100, then 1,000, with commanders appointed for merit rather than birth. Warriors were intentionally mixed to break the power of clan-based loyalties. Jamuka's army was traditional. Each noble clan brought its own detachment under its own leader, making unified command difficult. The battle began early in the morning. Temujin attempted his usual strategy: swift movements of light cavalry, distant arrow volleys, flank attacks, and diversions, followed by heavy cavalry charges in tight formations. At first, Temujin's forces gained the advantage, scattering several of Jamuka's units, but gradually superior numbers began to decide the outcome. Jamuka sent in fresh reserves that struck Temujin's flanks. The formation of Temujin's army began to compress. Disorder grew in the rear ranks. When a few units broke and fled, the collapse became irreversible. By midday, Jamuka held overwhelming advantage. Temujin's army retreated toward nearby forests. Some warriors died fighting. Others were captured. Temujin himself hid in the mountains but was captured several days later. What followed became a grim symbol of steppe warfare. Jamuka ordered 70 senior companions of Temujin to be executed. Chronicles say they were boiled alive, likely meaning a torturous public execution meant to terrify any who dared challenge the old order. Jamuka spared Temujin himself, perhaps out of lingering brotherhood, perhaps to display magnanimity, or perhaps believing that humiliation had destroyed Temujin's future, but it had not. After several weeks in captivity, he was freed, likely due to pressure from nobles who disapproved of Jamuka's extreme cruelty. Temujin re-entered the steppe not defeated, but hardened. The defeat became his greatest lesson. He realized that even his reorganized army still contained remnants of clan loyalty. Therefore, he abolished clan-based units entirely. Henceforth, every group of 10, every 100, and every 1,000 mixed warriors from different backgrounds to eliminate independent clan power. He tightened discipline severely. Punishments for desertion, cowardice, unauthorized retreat, hiding spoils, or disobeying orders applied to all equally, whether a poor shepherd or a nobleman's grandson. His system of personal loyalty deepened. Each warrior now swore allegiance not to clan but to the Khan and to the collective. His authority rested on protection, fairness, duty, and mutual responsibility. Gradually, people gathered around him again. His rules were clear and just. One did not need noble birth to rise. Only courage, honesty, hard work, and loyalty. By the early 1190s, Temujin's army had grown once more into a formidable force. Even clans that once despised him began reconsidering, sensing that he would not disappear and would never submit. Thus ended the painful yet transformative stage, the path from catastrophic defeat to the creation of a new and unprecedented power. Ahead awaited the great Kurultai that would change not only Temujin's fate, but the history of all Mongolia. By the beginning of the 13th century, the Mongolian steppe no longer resembled the old world whose order had rested on clan ties, ancient agreements between lineages, and a fragile balance of forces that shifted from season to season. And over the previous 2 decades, Temujin had been steadily dismantling this system, so that his power no longer depended on noble descent or the support of particular clans, but was built on something entirely different, on unconditional loyalty, on strict discipline, and on clear rules that were the same for everyone who was willing to recognize his authority. The main opponents that still remained were 3 great powers: the Karaits, the Tatars, and the Naimans, and it was precisely these peoples, possessing wealth, numerous warriors, and venerable old alliances, who resisted the new order longer than anyone else. While the Taichuds and the Merkits by that time had in fact been destroyed or scattered by years of campaigns, the final annihilation of the Taichuds becoming the result of a series of swift raids in which their camps were burned, their herds driven away, and the survivors either killed outright or unconditionally absorbed into Temujin's army, losing their former tribal identity. The first major campaign on the path to total dominance was the conflict with the Karaits. For many years, the Karait Khan Togrul had been Temujin's ally and patron, but as he felt Temujin's power growing and sensed that the balance in the steppe was changing irrevocably, he eventually tried to remove him, making open conflicts inevitable. Temujin gathered an army that included not only his own men, but also those who had already begun to come over to his side from among the former allies of the Karaits. The decisive battle took place in the year 1203 and ended in a complete defeat for the Karaits. Togrul fled but was soon killed by his own people, who no longer wished to follow a defeated Khan, and the remnants of the Karait people were absorbed into Temujin's host, where they lost their previous autonomy completely and became part of the new structure he was creating. The next step was the destruction of the Tatars, a tribe with which his lineage had been locked in a blood feud ever since the poisoning of his father, Yasuge. In the year 1202, the Tatars were defeated in a decisive battle, and by Temujin's order all adult males, all who were taller than the wheel of a cart, were executed, while the women and children were distributed among his warriors. This act was not only an act of vengeance, but also an act of terror meant to demonstrate to all remaining tribes that resistance to the new order was tantamount to complete annihilation, leaving no room for compromise or partial submission. The last and most dangerous enemy were the Naimans, a strong, wealthy, and populous people who occupied the lands to the west of Mongolia. Under the leadership of their Khan Kuchlug, the Naimans possessed a solid army and retained influence over many allies, and in the year 1204, the decisive battle took place. Temujin's army, now fully accustomed to the decimal organization and enjoying superiority in discipline and command, crushed the Naimans. Kuchlug himself fled at first to the Qara Khitai realm, and then even farther west, where he would later continue to fight, but no longer against Genghis Khan, rather against other states, and the Naimans ceased to exist as an independent political entity. After this victory, resistance within the steppe almost disappeared. The few detachments that still tried to act on their own either departed to far-off lands or surrendered without a fight, and Mongolia was finally and irreversibly unified under a single authority. In the spring of the year 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the Great Kurultai was convened. Representatives of all tribes, all clans, and all military units gathered there. Leaders and commanders, kinsmen and elders, advisors and ordinary warriors were present, and this Kurultai was not merely another assembly of chieftains, but became an act of birth, the birth of a new state, a new order, and a new epoch. At this Kurultai, Temujin was unanimously proclaimed the great Khan of all the Mongols, and from that moment his name entered history as Genghis Khan, a title that is often interpreted as Oceanic Khan, or Great Khan, emphasizing his power over the entire people and the whole land of Mongolia. One of the principal decisions of the Kurultai was the legal codification of the system that Temujin had been building over many years. The army and the entire population were now definitively divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, and units commanded by leaders of 10,000, and these formations became not only military structures, but also administrative units. People inside them were deliberately mixed, so that there would no longer be purely clan units, and so that everyone would serve not their lineage and not their local chieftain, but the Khan himself and the state as a whole. At the same gathering, the fundamental law of the empire was formed, the Great Yassa. It was not a single written code in the modern sense, but rather a system of rules that were memorized and passed on orally. The Yassa enshrined everything: the rules of warfare, the principles for distributing booty, punishments for crimes, the order of succession, the regulation of trade, and even details of everyday behavior. Violations of discipline, lying, theft, rebellion, desertion, and treason were all punishable by death, and every person in the empire knew that the rules were the same for everyone, regardless of origin or social rank. One of the most important provisions was the official establishment of religious tolerance. In the state of Genghis Khan, each person had the right to practice their own faith. Shamans, Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, all could freely pray to their gods. And moreover, religious figures were exempt from both taxes and military service, which gave the clergy of many traditions an obvious interest in accepting the new power. The Kurultai also approved the distribution of authority within the ruling circle. Genghis Khan's brothers, Qasar, Qachiun, and Temujin, received key functions. Qasar became the head of the personal guard and was responsible for the Khan's security. Temujin became the chief keeper of the royal camp, managing all household affairs, supplies, the movement of property, and order within the nomadic encampments. Qachiun was charged with the defense of the internal territories and with the protection of the rear. Special powers were granted to the senior generals, Subadeh, Jebe, Bo-Orshu, Jelme, and Mokali. They were not merely commanders of military units. Each of them became the de facto ruler of a part of the empire, subordinate to the Khan, but possessing broad autonomy in matters of tax collection, recruitment of men, conduct of war, and maintenance of order. Within society, a strict hierarchy was established. At the top stood the Khan and his family. Following them came a new type of aristocracy that arose not by blood, but by merit. Beneath them were the warriors, the backbone of the state. Below them, herders, artisans, and officials. And only at the very bottom were captives and slaves, who nevertheless had the possibility of rising if they proved their loyalty and distinguished themselves in battle or service. When the Great Kurultai ended, Genghis Khan was no longer simply the leader of a unified Mongolia. He had become the founder of a new empire that in the coming years would begin to move beyond the bounds of the steppe, extending its power over the lands of China, Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Europe. Thus the path of unification came to an end, and ahead lay the beginning of the path of conquest. When in the year 1206 Genghis Khan became the supreme ruler of United Mongolia, he understood very clearly that in order to preserve his power and maintain the cohesion of the vast army he had assembled, it was necessary to direct its energy beyond the limits of the steppe, because peace was impossible in a society that existed through war, booty, and the expansion of pastures. The first natural direction for expansion was the rich and densely populated north of China, the lands of the Jin Empire. The Jin state, founded by the Yurchens, had for decades played an active role in steppe politics, supporting some tribes against others, distributing gifts to certain chieftains while threatening others. It was the Jin court that had once supported Genghis Khan's enemies, the Naimans and the Carats, in their attempts to prevent the unification of Mongolia, and in the past, the Mongols themselves had paid tribute to Jin, a fact Genghis Khan perceived not merely as humiliation, but as a symbol of dependence, a condition he no longer intended to endure. Before beginning a full-scale war, Genghis Khan conducted a series of negotiations with the state of Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom that lay between Mongolia and the Jin frontiers. Western Xia was formerly a vassal of Jin, but in practice strove to preserve its independence and watched with caution the growing might of the Mongols. In the spring of the year 1209, Genghis Khan launched a campaign against Western Xia, laid siege to its capital city, Yulin, and after stubborn fighting forced the Tangut rulers to recognize his authority. Western Xia agreed to pay tribute and provide assistance, but remained a formally independent state. This success opened the road southward toward the borders of the Jin Empire. In the spring of the year 1211, an army estimated by various sources at from 90 to 100,000 men crossed the Great Wall. The first blows fell on border garrisons and fortifications, many of which were taken with little resistance, as local commanders often chose to surrender, understanding that the Mongol army brought almost inevitable defeat to anyone who attempted to stand against it. Genghis Khan, however, was keenly aware that this war would be completely different from steppe campaigns, since it required the ability to capture cities with powerful stone walls and to fight garrisons defended not only by weapons, but also by elaborate fortification systems. Therefore, along with his cavalry, he began to employ engineers and craftsmen from conquered peoples, Uyghurs, Tanguts, and Chinese, who possessed knowledge of siegecraft and could build complex machines. The first major operations unfolded in the provinces of Hebei and Shanxi, where Mongol detachments systematically dismantled fortifications, cut roads, destroyed supply depots, and seized city after city. Especially important were the battles for Yanjing, a strategic center of northern China, and for the city of Datong, which controlled one of the key passes. Mongol strategy was ruthlessly simple. First, the army encircled a city, cutting off all routes of supply. Then a siege began, using trebuchets, catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. If a city surrendered, its population often retained its life in exchange for complete submission, payment of tribute, and the provision of recruits. If a city resisted, its fate was usually predetermined: massacre, enslavement of survivors, and the near-total destruction of its defenses. The central event of the campaign was the siege of the Jin capital, Zhongdu, located where modern Beijing stands. The first siege took place in the year 1213, but at that time, faced with protracted resistance, the Mongols chose to make peace and withdrew part of their forces. The Jin emperor agreed to pay indemnities and send tribute. However, Already in the year 1214, when Jin violated the terms of the agreement and attempted to strengthen its authority in the northern provinces, Genghis Khan returned. This time he acted methodically and without mercy. Zhengdu was encircled, all roads were cut, and supplies were stopped. The city possessed massive walls, substantial grain reserves, and a strong garrison, so the siege dragged on for many months. The Mongols used everything at their disposal: siege towers, giant trebuchets that hurled stones and incendiary mixtures, and even primitive gunpowder bombs which the Chinese had already begun to employ in defense and which the Mongols quickly adapted for their own purposes. Zhengdu fell in the year 1215. Under the agreement concluded immediately prior to the capitulation, the population of the city was promised mercy. But soon after, the surrender riots broke out, and one of the districts attempted an uprising. In response, Genghis Khan ordered a massacre. According to some sources, up to 60,000 people were killed, while the rest were either enslaved or resettled. After the fall of Zhengdu, the Jin Emperor, realizing that northern China could no longer be held, moved the capital south to the city of Kaifeng. And this step in practice signified the recognition of the loss of the northern provinces, even though formally peace with the Mongols still existed. The empire continued to exist, but was now forced to pay tribute and acknowledge Genghis Khan's supremacy over the northern lands. Over the next 2 years, Mongol armies finished off resistance in various provinces, taking Liaoyang, Taiyuan, Pingcheng, and other key cities. In one of the most famous episodes, the siege of the fortress of Tongguan, located on a mountain pass, the garrison refused to surrender even after weeks of bombardment. Then, by Genghis Khan's order, the Mongols blocked the river that supplied the fortress with water, and when the defenders were left without water, they capitulated within a few days. A distinctive feature of this war was that Genghis Khan, for the first time on such a scale, systematically employed not only brute force, but also political calculation. He offered cities the chance to surrender and preserve a measure of self-government and some of their rights in exchange for the recognition of his authority. And many local elites agreed, understanding that the alternative was the complete destruction of their communities. By the year 1217, all of northern China had come under Mongol control. Yet Genghis Khan did not push much farther south, fully aware that merely holding these vast territories would be an enormous strain on his resources, and besides, new dangers were growing in the west. The Qara Khitai realm was still a factor, and tensions were increasing with the Muslim trading states of Central Asia. The outcome of the war was unequivocal. For the first time, the Mongols had firmly established themselves within the sedentary world, gaining not only military trophies, but also a developed infrastructure: cities, crafts, technologies, tax systems, and human resources. They learned how to capture fortresses, conduct long sieges, and use Chinese technologies such as advanced siege engines, explosive mixtures, and engineering constructions. Northern China became a reliable source of resources for future conquests, and the army of Genghis Khan, now possessing experience not only in swift steppe raids but also in full-scale siege campaigns, prepared for new invasions. To the west, were caravan routes, wealthy cities of Central Asia, and Muslim states awaited them. When after the victory over Jin and the unification of Mongolia, the frontiers of Genghis Khan's empire stabilized in the east, his gaze more and more often turned westward, toward the lands beyond the mountains and deserts where the world of caravan routes, trading cities, and wealthy states began, a world that had long lived according to laws very different from those of the nomadic steppe. This world beckoned with its opportunities, and at the same time represented a potential threat, for any prosperous neighboring state could one day become an enemy. The first step in this western direction was the campaign against the Qara Khitai Empire, a state formed by the descendants of the Liao dynasty, who, after the fall of their realm in northern China, had migrated to Central Asia and created their own empire, uniting the lands of Semiriche, eastern Turkestan, Fergana, and parts of what is now Xinjiang. For decades, the Qara Khitai had collected tribute from the Muslim states of the region, including Khwarazm, but by the beginning of the 13th century their power was gradually weakening. The pretext for intervention was provided by the fugitive Naiman prince Kushlug, who, after the defeat of the Naimans, found refuge at the court of the Qara Khitai Gurkhan Yelujelugu. By marrying the Gurkhan's daughter and exploiting instability at the top, Kushlug seized control, pushed the Gurkhan aside from real governance, and in effect became the ruler of the Qara Khitai Empire. Kushlug's rule soon provoked widespread discontent. He began openly persecuting Muslims, imposing Buddhism and restricting Islamic religious practices. Mosques were closed, muezzins were forbidden to call the faithful to prayer, and Sharia courts were abolished. All this sparked open uprisings among the local population and sharply increased tensions in the region. Genghis Khan could not ignore such an opportunity. In the spring of the year 1218, he sent a corps under the command of Jebe, one of his best generals, against Qara Khitai. The army crossed Zungaria, moved along the Ili River, and swiftly entered the Qara Khitai realm. Local rulers opened their gates one after another, well aware that resistance to the Mongols was pointless, and hoping to preserve their positions in exchange for submission to the new overlord. The Gurkhan fled, and Kushlug tried to hide in the mountains of the Pamir, but Mongol detachments quickly overtook, captured, and executed him. Thus the Qara Khitai Empire ceased to exist. Its territories were incorporated into the Mongol Empire, and Genghis Khan kept much of the existing administration in place, restored to Muslims the freedom of worship, and proclaimed that each person could follow any religion so long as they recognized the authority of the Great Khan. This campaign became the first direct encounter between the Mongols and the Muslim world, and for the first time, Mongol troops found themselves near the great trading centers of Central Asia, Kashgar, Balasagun, and the Fergana region. Here too began their first direct contact with one of the most powerful Muslim states of the era, the Khwarezmian Empire. Under Sultan Ala ad-Din Muhammad, the Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century was the largest state in Central Asia. It encompassed vast territories, from the southern shores of the Caspian Sea to the mountain regions of Afghanistan and eastern Iran, and within its borders lay such major cities as Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur, and Herat. The state possessed a centralized administration, an extensive tax system, a large army, and actively participated in international trade. Relations between Genghis Khan and Khwarazm at first began peacefully. In the year 1218, the Mongol ruler sent a large trade caravan, by various accounts numbering from 150 to 500 people, laden with valuable goods, furs, silver, gold, textiles, and weapons. The caravan arrived in the city of Otrar, an important trading center on the frontier of the Khwarezmian Empire. It was here that an incident occurred which would prove fatal. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, known by the title Gair Khan, accused the caravan of spying. The motives behind his decision remain the subject of debate to this day. Perhaps greed, fear of the rising power of the Mongols, personal ambition, or uncertainty about support from the Sultan played a role. The caravan was arrested, all goods were confiscated, and its members were executed. When Genghis Khan learned of this, he did not immediately resort to war. He sent 3 envoys to the Khwarezmian capital, Gurganj, demanding that Inalchuk be punished, that the goods be returned, and that friendly relations be restored. The response was unprecedented in its offensiveness. One of the envoys was killed, and the other 2 had their foreheads branded with red-hot iron. In the steppe code, such an act was perceived not simply as a refusal of diplomacy, but as a declaration of total war. After this, Genghis Khan convened a Kurultai, at which the decision was made to launch a full-scale campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. Preparations began immediately, and according to various estimates, Genghis Khan gathered an army numbering from 150 to 200,000 men, a scale previously unseen in steppe history. The army was divided into several autonomous corps, each commanded by seasoned generals: Subadeh, Jebe, Ogadeh, Chagatai, and Jochi. A strategy unprecedented for its time was developed. Genghis Khan's main forces moved through Semirechye toward Transoxiana. Another corps under Subadeh and Jebe advanced farther north, skirting the Aral Sea and entering the Khwarezmian rear. Yet another corps crossed the Pamir and moved from the south. Such a broad enveloping maneuver made it possible to attack from multiple directions at once, paralyzing the enemy's ability to concentrate and coordinate its forces. Thus began one of the most devastating campaigns of the 13th century, and ahead of the Mongol army lay the wealthy, populous, and well-fortified cities of Central Asia. When the army of Genghis Khan crossed the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire, these lands, with their caravan cities, mosques and madrasas, noisy bazaars, garden suburbs, and centuries-old traditions of trade and craftsmanship, suddenly found themselves face to face with a power the like of which they had never known before, for this was not merely an army in the habitual sense, but an almost perfect war machine, created by a nomadic genius and driven not only by the desire to win, but also by a harsh inner logic, to destroy old orders, break all resistance, and subordinate everything living to a new world order. The first target was the city of Otrar, the very place where the diplomatic conflict had begun that had become the formal pretext for the war. Inalchuk, the city's governor who had ordered the execution of the Mongol merchants, understood perfectly well that there would be no forgiveness. The siege began at the end of the year, 1219, and lasted for almost 5 months. The city possessed strong walls and deep ditches and was well supplied with water and provisions. The Mongols used the full arsenal of siege warfare, trebuchets, catapults, mining under the walls, and the diversion of rivers. When the outer walls finally fell, part of the garrison retreated into the citadel, and the resistance continued for several more weeks until the last bastion was taken. Inalchuk was captured alive. According to later tradition, he was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. Although modern historians tend to regard this as a literary image born from the imagination of chroniclers, yet the fact that his execution was public and cruel is beyond doubt. After the fall of Otrar, Genghis Khan's army was divided. The main forces, under his personal command, moved toward Bukhara and Samarkand. The corps of Jebe and Subadeh marched westward in pursuit of the Shah himself, Ala ad-Din, who had already begun his retreat. Another detachment was sent southward into the region of Merv and Herat. Bukhara became the first major objective. In the spring of the year, 1220, the Mongol army surrounded the city. The garrison, instead of waiting for a siege, left the walls and tried to give battle in the open field, but was completely defeated. After that, the gates were left unprotected, and Genghis Khan entered the city without a fight. According to Persian chroniclers, he ascended the minbar of the main mosque and declared, "I am the scourge of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent punishment like me upon you." And whether or not the exact words are accurate, the meaning of the scene became emblematic. The inhabitants were ordered to collect a ransom. Part of the population was massacred, part was taken into slavery. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, armorers, stone and woodworkers were, by Mongol custom, spared and resettled in Mongolia or in other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. After the capture of Bukhara, the road led onward to Samarkand, the capital of the Khwarazmian Empire. The city possessed extremely strong fortifications, a garrison of more than 40,000 warriors, several war elephants, and a significant number of mercenaries, including Turkic and even Indian soldiers. The Mongols began the siege with a complete blockade of the city, using catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers. Attempts by the garrison to make sorties ended in failure, and panic gradually spread inside the walls. After a few days, part of the soldiers, fearing inevitable defeat, chose to surrender, while others tried to flee, and this disintegration of unity became the signal for the Mongols to begin a full-scale assault. Once the city was taken, the massacre began. All the warriors and the entire adult male population were killed. Women and children were driven into slavery. Only specialists, builders, armorers, engineers, were left alive and resettled either in Mongolia or in other parts of the vast empire. Meanwhile, the Khwarazm Shah had left Samarkand long before the siege and continued his flight. Realizing that it was no longer possible to retain power, he sought refuge first in Khorasan, then in the western outskirts of his domains. In the end, he found himself on one of the islands in the Caspian Sea, where he soon fell ill and died, far from his capital and without hope of returning. The last and hardest stronghold of resistance was Urgench, the richest city in the delta of the Amudarya. Urgench was not only an economic center, but also one of the principal spiritual and political hubs of the region. Its geographical position, among rivers, marshes, and canals, made a full assault especially difficult. The siege dragged on for many months, and sources mention that even among the Mongol commanders disputes arose as to whether the city should be preserved for the sake of its wealth or destroyed to break the will of any future resistance once and for all. The decision turned out to be merciless. After the defenses were breached, one of the most brutal massacres of the entire campaign began. According to Persian chroniclers, the number of those killed reached several hundreds of thousands, though modern historians consider these figures greatly exaggerated. Nevertheless, the city was almost literally wiped from the face of the earth. After the fall of Urgench, Khwarezmian resistance came to a final end. The Mongols moved south into Khorasan and further into the lands of Iran and Afghanistan. The city of Merv was taken according to the same scenario. After refusing to surrender, it was stormed, and its population was almost entirely annihilated. A similar fate befell Nishapur, where, according to the chronicles, by order of Genghis Khan's son Tolui, the entire population was destroyed in revenge for the death of a relative of the Mongol nobility killed during the siege. Nishapur was literally leveled, its walls destroyed, buildings burned, and corpses thrown into wells so that they would forever be unfit for use, and life would not easily return. After the devastation of Khorasan was completed, the main forces of Genghis Khan began to assemble for the return to the east, but not all of them. The corps under the command of Jebe and Subadeh received a special order to continue moving westward, to explore the lands beyond the Caucasus, and to discover the boundaries of the inhabited world. Thus began the western raid that would soon lead the Mongols to the Caucasus, to the steppelands of the Cumans, and to the Rus's principalities. So ended one of the most brutal military campaigns of the Middle Ages, the total destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire and the subjugation of all Central Asia. Yet for Genghis Khan and his warriors, new lands and new trials still lay ahead. After the complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, when the lands of Central Asia, Khorasan, and eastern Iran had been subdued, Genghis Khan, while preparing to return to Mongolia, made a strategic decision to send a reconnaissance corps far to the west, into lands lying beyond the Caspian Sea, beyond the Caucasus Mountains, and beyond the endless steppes where, according to merchant stories, there lived strange nomadic peoples whose customs, laws, and even languages were almost unknown to the Mongols. This task was entrusted to two outstanding generals, Jebe and Subadeh. According to Genghis Khan's plan, their corps was to pass through unknown territories, gather information about the peoples living there, their military strength, wealth, numbers, fortresses, routes, and centers of trade, and assess the prospects for future campaigns. It was not a campaign of conquest in the classical sense, yet also not merely a reconnaissance mission. Rather, it was a journey in which anyone who dared resist would be broken, every fortress that barred their way destroyed, and every ruler who refused to acknowledge the authority of the great Khan punished. In the spring of the year, 1221, an army numbering around 20 to 30,000 horsemen left the borders of Central Asia and moved through the steppes north of the Caspian Sea. Their path ran through the lands of what is now Kazakhstan and the Lower Volga region, and then toward the Caucasus Mountains. Along this entire route, the Mongols acted in their usual manner. They ravaged settlements, took captives, seized livestock, and crushed any detachments that attempted resistance. On the approaches to the Caucasus, they confronted an alliance of Alans and Circassians who organized the defense of the mountain passes and defiles. The Highlanders fought fiercely, making use of the natural advantages of the rugged terrain, and the Mongols, accustomed to open steppe battles, encountered serious difficulties. Then Jebe and Subadeh resorted to a tried and tested method: diplomacy. They sent envoys to the Cumans, who roamed to the north of the Caucasus and had long been in conflict with the Alans. The Mongols proposed an alliance to the Cumans, to destroy the Alans and Circassians together, divide the spoils, and then peacefully go their separate ways. The Cumans agreed. The combined forces struck the Highlanders from the plains and from the mountain passes simultaneously. The defense collapsed. The Alan and Circassian lands were plundered, part of the population was taken captive, and many settlements were burned. But soon after the victory, the alliance fell apart. The Mongols, faithful to their own logic of war, demanded that the Cumans submit to the Great Khan and pay tribute. The Cumans refused, and their Khan, Kotian, turned for help to his closest political partners, the Rus' princes. Cuman envoys were sent to Kiev, Galicia, Chernihiv, and other principalities, asking for support. Despite a long history of conflicts with the Cumans, the Rus princes perceived the arrival of the Mongols as a common threat, so distant and unpredictable did this new enemy seem. It was decided to unite their forces. In the spring of the year 1223, the Rus' princes gathered a coalition army. It included detachments from Kiev, the Galician Volhynian Principality, Smolensk, Kursk, Pereyazlav, and Chernihiv. Command was exercised by three princes: Mstislav of Kiev, Mstislav of Chernihiv, and Mstislav the Bold of Galicia. Large Cuman contingents joined them. The total strength of the army, according to various estimates, ranged from 40 to 60,000 men. Jebe and Subadeh employed classic Mongol tactics. They began to retreat, feigning flight and luring their opponents deeper into the steppe. The Rusas and Cuman forces, carried away by the pursuit, gradually lost their vigilance. Discipline weakened, and there was no unified coordination between the various contingents of the coalition. Each prince acted according to his own judgment and ambition. On the 31st day of May, in the year 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River, the decisive battle took place. The Mongols suddenly turned and struck with full force against the Cuman vanguard, which had been the first to become embroiled in battle. The Cumans, unable to withstand the blow, broke and fled, abandoning their allies. The main Rus' forces were then attacked from several sides at once. Their formation was disrupted, and the battle quickly turned into a series of scattered engagements. Only Mstislav of Kiev, with part of his forces, managed to set up a fortified camp, an earthen rampart with a wooden palisade. There he held out for 3 days under complete encirclement. The Mongols did not rush to storm the camp. They cut off access to water, exhausting the defenders, and then offered to accept their surrender under an oath to spare their lives. When the camp opened its gates, the Mongols broke their oath. According to the chronicles, the prince and his closest boyars were executed in a particularly cruel manner. They were laid under a wooden platform and suffocated while the victors held a feast above them, and the rest were killed in the ensuing massacre. A small number of survivors, including Mstislav the Bold, escaped only thanks to the speed of their cavalry units and their knowledge of the steppe routes. After the battle on the Kalka, the Mongols did not push farther into Rus' lands. Their task had been accomplished. They had obtained exhaustive information about the condition of the western states, their armies, tactics, political relations, and vulnerabilities. The Caucasian peoples, the Cumans, and the Rus' principalities had demonstrated precisely what Genghis Khan had wished to understand: a complete lack of unity and an inability to mount a coordinated defense. The corps of Jebe and Subadeh turned back through the North Caucasus, once again devastating the lands of Circassians and Alans, driving off their herds, taking prisoners, and gathering rich plunder. In the year 1224, they returned to Mongolia, having completed the greatest reconnaissance in force expedition of the 13th century. This campaign convinced the Mongols that the Western world was rich, divided, and vulnerable. Genghis Khan understood that the day would come when these lands would be drawn into the orbit of the empire. But first, another front awaited him: the final war against the Tanguts, and the events that would become the closing chapter of his own life. When the Mongol army, having completed its grand western campaign, returned to its native steppes, Genghis Khan, already sensing that his life was approaching its final turn, decided to finish what had remained incomplete since the very beginning of his rise to power. This unresolved issue was the state of Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom that lay between the deserts of Ordos, the Alishan Mountains, and the upper reaches of the Yellow River, along the western borders of China. Relations with Western Xia had been uneasy from the start. As early as the year 1209, Genghis Khan had conducted his first campaign against the Tanguts, compelling them to recognize themselves as vassals and agree to pay tribute. Yet this agreement had never been truly stable. Each time the armies of Genghis Khan departed on distant campaigns of conquest, the Tangut rulers began to evade their obligations, delaying tribute, refusing to provide auxiliary troops, and during the campaign against Khwarazm they openly violated the treaty, demonstratively failing to send the promised support. This challenge was perceived by Genghis Khan as something greater than a simple act of political disobedience, for in the eyes of the Khan, such behavior meant an assault on the very idea of his rule. The empire was built on the principle that every conquered people must obey unconditionally, and anyone who broke that order became not just an enemy, but a threat to the very existence of the world order that the Mongols were imposing on those around them. In the spring of the year 1226, the Mongol army set out on campaign. This was the last campaign personally led by Genghis Khan. The army advanced in several columns at once, through the valleys along the foothills of the Gobi, across the desert plains of Ordos, and along the course of the Yellow River. The important strategic stronghold of Huining was taken first, after which the garrisons along the western borders of Western Xia fell in turn. The Mongols methodically destroyed irrigation systems, burned granaries, and trampled fields, depriving the Tanguts of the resources necessary to sustain their resistance. Simultaneously with the military operations, a systematic campaign of economic devastation unfolded. Commercial caravanserais were destroyed, warehouses were plundered, markets were razed. The Mongols intercepted caravans moving from China to Central Asia, effectively cutting Western Xia off from its external economic ties and turning the kingdom into an isolated and gradually starving enclave. Fighting was especially fierce around the fortress city of Liangzhou. The garrison put up desperate resistance, but after 2 months of siege, the city fell. The Mongols then destroyed the dams that supplied the region with water, which led to drought and the loss of harvest over hundreds of kilometers, turning once fertile lands into barren ground. As the army advanced toward the capital, it surrounded and destroyed one city after another. Those who tried to resist were exterminated, and those who surrendered were plundered and deported. Cities were turned into wastelands, and their inhabitants into slaves or captives driven away to Mongolia. In the summer of the year 1226, Genghis Khan approached the capital of Western Xia, Zhongxing. The city stood in a picturesque valley at the foot of the Helen Mountains, surrounded by thick stone walls with numerous towers, and it was one of the most heavily fortified capitals of the region. The Mongols began a long and methodical siege, cutting off all supply routes and depriving the city of water and food. It was during this period that an event occurred which later became fateful for Genghis Khan himself. On one of his hunts, or possibly as the result of an accident in camp, he fell from his horse and suffered a severe injury, either a broken hip or damage to his spine. Chronicles offer differing versions, but they all agree on one thing. From that moment, the Khan's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The pain intensified, the wound did not heal, inflammation set in, yet even in this condition he continued to direct the siege and make crucial decisions. Despite his worsening health, Genghis Khan convened war councils daily, personally listened to reports from his commanders, and discussed with his sons and senior Noyans questions of succession, future campaigns, and the administration of the empire after his death. By the beginning of August of the year 1227, Genghis Khan was already confined to his mobile yurt. It was difficult for him to move. The pain had become constant, yet he refused to relinquish command. In the last weeks of his life, he gathered his sons several times and gave them instructions on how to keep the empire united, on the necessity of continuing campaigns to the south against the Song dynasty, and on the importance of preserving the internal order of the state. In the middle of August of the year 1227, in the midst of the siege of Zhongxing, Genghis Khan died. His death was immediately kept secret. It was concealed from the army so as not to weaken morale and not to give the enemy the slightest reason to hope for salvation. Orders continued to be issued in his name, and his body was placed in a wagon accompanied by an honor guard. Zhongxing fell soon after his death. The city was destroyed, and its population completely annihilated. The state of Western Xia disappeared forever, its lands absorbed into the Mongol Empire. The burial of Genghis Khan became one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the medieval world. According to tradition, his body was taken to Mongolia and buried in a secret place on the slopes of the Khenti Range. Any people who happened to cross the path of the funeral procession were killed, and after the burial was completed, a herd of horses was driven over the site to erase all traces. The location of his grave remains unknown to this day. Thus ended the life of Genghis Khan, a man who, from a nameless orphan expelled from his own clan, became the creator of the greatest land empire in human history. Yet his death did not mark the end of that empire. On the contrary, new battles, new conquests, and the struggle for power among his sons still lay ahead. The death of Genghis Khan in the month of August in the year 1227 was not merely the end of the life of one of the greatest conquerors in human history, but also the moment when his family, his closest companions, and the entire empire were confronted with the main question of what would happen next, how to preserve what had been created, and who would become the new ruler of the world that had been united under a single authority stretching from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the waters of the Caspian Sea. For all its seeming solidity, the empire of Genghis Khan had from the very beginning not been built as a purely personal patrimony, but as a special form of power founded on the principles of the Kurultai, the assembly of elders, noyans, generals, and representatives of all clans. This was not merely a custom, but the foundation of the political order. And although during the lifetime of the great Khan the final word always belonged to him, the right to choose his successor remained with the Kurultai, which embodied the shared will of the ruling elite of the empire. During his life, Genghis Khan more than once reflected on the future of his state. His eldest son was Yoshi, yet by the end of Genghis Khan's life, their relationship had become tense. In addition to the old rumors about Joshi's origin, connected with his birth shortly after Berta's captivity among the Merkits, real political disagreements had emerged between father and son in the last years. Joshi more and more often preferred to remain in the western part of the empire, in the lands given to him after the conquest of Central Asia, and he expressed dissatisfaction with his father's harsh methods, advocating a milder policy towards subjugated peoples. This rift became so serious that some years before Genghis Khan's death, relations between them had all but ceased. Yet fate intervened in its own way. Yoshi died at the beginning of the year 1227, only a few months before the death of the great Khan himself. This event removed the main intrigue surrounding his possible succession, but immediately raised another question. How would the balance now be structured between Joshi's sons and the remaining branches of the family? Of the three surviving sons of Genghis Khan, the eldest was Chagatai, a man of stern, sometimes harsh character, not inclined to compromise and known for his strict, unyielding devotion to the Yassa. He had repeatedly and openly expressed his doubts about Yoshi's origin, and did not conceal that he was not prepared to regard Yoshi's descendants as fully equal to himself. Tolui, the youngest son, was an outstanding commander and a gifted organizer, yet by Mongol tradition the youngest son became the keeper of the ancestral hearth and the homeland. That is, he remained in Mongolia, governing the central territories and the lands of the forefathers, but did not claim the title of Great Khan. There remained Ogedei, the third son, distinguished by a balanced character, a gift for diplomacy, and an ability to reconcile conflicts and find compromises. Genghis Khan had made it very clear while still alive that it was Ogedei who should become his successor. In this decision he saw not only justice, but also the best guarantee that the brothers would not drag the empire into a civil war that could destroy all that had been built. After the army returned from the west and after the completion of the campaign against Western Sia, the body of Genghis Khan was secretly buried on the slopes of the Khenti range, and central authority passed into the hands of his widow Berta and his youngest son Tolui, who, in the capacity of regent, temporarily governed the state until the Kurultai could be convened. The organization of the Kurultai required time, for it was necessary not only to gather all members of the ruling family, but also to summon the noyans, the generals, and the representatives of all the conquered peoples whose rulers now depended on the Mongol Empire. The journey from Central Asia, China, the Caucasus, or Eastern Europe took many months and sometimes even years. It was precisely Berta who played the decisive role in preventing a split during that transitional period. Making use of her immense authority, she managed to keep the different centers of power in balance and prevent the beginning of open confrontation between the branches of the family, which might otherwise have turned into fratricidal war. The Kurultai finally took place in the year 1229. Already in its first days, it became clear that the sharpest conflict was developing between Chagatai and the descendants of Joshi. Although Joshi was dead, his eldest son Batu, despite his youth, already possessed real power in the western part of the empire. Chagatai, with his customary bluntness, declared that he did not recognize this line as fully equal because he continued to doubt Yoshi's origin. The dispute nearly turned into an armed confrontation, but at this crucial moment, Tolui intervened. Tolui proposed a compromise. He renounced any claims to supreme power in favor of Ogedei, who had been designated heir by Genghis Khan himself. Ogedei was recognized by all participants of the Kurultai as a worthy successor, a man capable of holding the empire together. In return, Tolui retained for himself the central lands of Mongolia and the role of head of the ruling clan, while Chagatai and Joshi's descendants received their own spheres of governance within the framework of the United Empire. This was not a division into independent states. On the contrary, the entire empire remained a single whole under the supreme authority of the Great Khan. However, each branch of the dynasty received its own administrative zone in which it governed under the single law of the Yassa, yet with a measure of internal self-rule, so that the line of Joshi administered the western steppes, Central Asia, and the lands that would later become known as the Golden Horde. The line of Chagatai governed Transoxiana, the Fergana region, and eastern Turkestan. The line of Tolui held central Mongolia and the lands around the Khenti Mountains, and the line of Ogedei retained the supreme power and controlled the most important administrative and commercial centers of the empire. After Ogedei was affirmed as Great Khan, the Kurultai adopted a number of crucial decisions. First, it confirmed the necessity of continuing expansion, both to the south, into the lands of the Song dynasty, and to the west, into Eastern Europe and the Near East. Second, a reform of governance was initiated. The institution of tax collection was strengthened, a system of YAM, the state postal and courier service, was developed to secure communication between the far-flung parts of the empire, and new forms of population registration and accounting of tax revenues were introduced so that the empire could be governed more rationally. Thus, despite the death of Genghis Khan, the empire did not disintegrate. On the contrary, it entered a new phase of growth. Conquest continued, frontiers expanded, and the empire itself ceased to be merely a collection of conquered lands and became a true superpower, governed according to a single principle and possessing a coherent imperial structure. When the dust of the last battles had settled and the name of Genghis Khan ceased to be a battle cry shouted across the steppe and instead became part of chronicles, legends, and stories told at the hearth, it became clear that the man who had been born without power, without wealth, and without support had changed not only the destiny of his own people, but the course of world history as a whole. The empire he created had no precedent in earlier epochs. It was not merely a sum of conquered territories. It was a system constructed upon strict order, unified law, a shared administrative structure, and a finely tuned military and fiscal organization. The empire, which united lands from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea and from the forests of Siberia to the Himalayas, for the first time in history, linked east and west under the authority of a single state. His principal achievement was not only the conquest of territory, but also the creation of an effective model of governance that proved extraordinarily resilient. Where previously there had been scattered tribal alliances, khanates, and kingdoms, there now operated a single law for all, the Yassa, which regulated both military and civil affairs. Violation of the law was punished in the same way for everyone, whether the offender was a simple nomad, a city merchant, or an influential ruler. One of the key principles he introduced was religious tolerance. In a world where religious wars and persecutions were almost the norm, Genghis Khan established an order under which Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, Nestorians, and shamans could freely practice their faith, preserving their rituals, temples, sanctuaries, and spiritual leaders. The only overarching requirement was absolute loyalty to the supreme authority of the Great Khan. The Mongol Empire became a space in which, for the first time in many centuries, free movement of goods, ideas, technologies, and people was restored on a continental scale. The Great Silk Road, which in previous centuries had repeatedly declined due to wars and internal strife, gained new life. Merchants could cross the continent from Persia to China, from the Volga to northern China, without constant fear of brigands, for the army of the Khan was responsible for maintaining order throughout the empire's territory. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan had another side as well. His name is inseparably associated with the deaths of countless people, with the destruction of cities, libraries, and centers of culture. The steppe campaigns, the devastation of Khwarazm, the sack of Bukhara and Samarkand, the burning of Nishapur, the ravaging of northern China. All of this entered the chronicles as examples of destruction on a scale previously unseen. And still, if one evaluates that era from the perspective of historical processes, it becomes evident that the empire of Genghis Khan was not only a force of destruction, but also a force that led to the emergence of new forms of international order. It was the first political entity to make the Eurasian continent truly interconnected, economically, politically, and culturally. Never before had ideas, technologies, people, and goods moved so freely and relatively safely across such vast distances. Genghis Khan himself, lacking formal education and unable to read or write, possessed an extraordinary strategic mind. His capacity for flexible diplomacy, his ability to learn rapidly, to adopt the best practices of conquered peoples, and to integrate them into his own administrative system, made him one of the greatest statesmen in the history of humanity. He knew how to recognize talent in people regardless of their origin. In his army and administration served Uyghurs, Chinese, Persians, Khwarezmians, Rus, Arabs, Tibetans, and many others. The best engineers, siege experts, physicians, scribes, and builders received his patronage. The state that had grown out of a steppe yurt became a system in which nomadic traditions were combined with the achievements of Chinese bureaucracy, Persian tax administration, and the commercial culture of the Islamic world. After his death, the empire did not collapse. It continued to expand. His sons and grandsons completed the conquest of China, destroyed Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate, defeated the armies of Poland and Hungary, subdued Korea and parts of Southeast Asia. Yet, like any enormous state created by the genius of a single man, it gradually began to fragment into independent khanates, each of which lived according to its own rules, but carried within it the imprint of those laws, decisions, and structures that had been laid down by Genghis Khan himself. And still, despite the millions of soldiers, the thousands of cities, and the tens of millions of subjects, the memory of Genghis Khan is not simply the memory of a conqueror. It is the memory of a man who transformed the chaos of the nomadic steppe into a power capable of changing half the world. The name of Genghis Khan will remain in history forever, for some as a symbol of destruction, for others as a symbol of order, law, and strength, for still others as a reminder that even a person deprived of everything, expelled and rejected, can change the world if he possesses enough will, determination, and talent. And today, when the caravan routes have become highways, when airplanes cross the skies and railways stretch across the steppe, the name of Genghis Khan sounds just as it did 800 years ago. Short, powerful, and majestic. Genghis Khan, the man who changed the world.